Think you're tough? Try surviving Rome in 751 AD, where every hour was a brutal test of grit. The city wasn't basking in imperial glory, it was clawing through chaos. With the Byzantine Exarchate wiped out and Lombard forces closing in, Rome was a battleground of collapsing politics, rigid class divides, and daily survival struggles. Patricians clung to fading prestige, plebeians packed into crumbling insulae, and slaves endured relentless toil in smoky, disease-ridden quarters. Fires, floods, and famine weren't rare, they were routine. And with no central authority, the Pope was the last thread holding it all together. In this unforgiving world, comfort was a fantasy and safety a gamble. One day here, you'd be lucky to make it to sunset. So today, let's explore what it truly meant to endure 751 AD Rome. The rough political landscape of 751 AD, by 751 AD, Rome was no longer the seat of a grand empire. The glory days of emperors and legions were over, replaced by a battleground of powers, each vying for survival and dominance. The Byzantine Empire, centered in distant Constantinople, still nominally ruled parts of Italy, but its grip on central power was slipping. In practice, real authority rested uneasily between local dukes, the Pope, and the encroaching Lombard kings. The city was technically still part of the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna, but this administrative region was a shadow of its former self, fragmented and weak despite its claims. The Exarch, Byzantine governor in Ravenna, remained an imperial symbol, but in 751, with the Lombard conquest of Ravenna by King Aistulf, the Exarchate collapsed. Eventually, the city of Rome braced itself for whatever came next, dependent on the Pope for leadership and on the city's own defensive capabilities for immediate safety. The political uncertainty bred anxiety and a constant threat of violence and instability. The rise of the Lombards under Aistulf. To the northwest, the Lombard kingdom led by Aistulf from the capital at Pavia was flexing its muscles. These were not newcomers. Lombards had been pushing into Italy since the late 6th century, gradually chipping away Byzantine control. King Aistulf was aggressive, ambitious, and bent on unifying Italy under his rule. In 751, after laying siege to Ravenna, Aistulf captured this last Byzantine stronghold in the north, sending shockwaves towards Rome. He demanded tribute from the Romans and was poised to threaten the city itself. Having declared himself the new king of the Romans, Aistulf believed that the empire's former supremacy in Italy was now extinct. As a result, the Roman Pope Stephen was unable to exercise the same pastoral diplomacy that his predecessor Pope Zachary had over both Liutprand and Ratchis. At Ravenna, Aistulf demanded tribute from the Roman duchy itself, straining papal coffers and greatly worrying Pope Stephen enough that he began negotiations with the Franks. So the conquest of Ravenna didn't just end a branch of Byzantine administration, it cut Rome off from any significant direct aid from Constantinople. With Aistulf's expansion, the papacy and central Italian cities found themselves dangerously exposed, forced to look for new political partners, increasingly turning to the Franks for survival. The Byzantine shadow. However, Byzantium's far-off emperors regarded Rome, Ravenna, and central Italy as theirs, at least on paper. But realities on the ground were different. The regions of Italy not controlled by the Lombards were constantly in a state of anxiety, caught between the directives from a remote exarch in Ravenna until 751 and the political, fiscal, and religious aspirations of the increasingly confident popes. Eutychius, the last exarch of Ravenna, was killed by the Lombards in 751. With the exarchate gone, the last vestiges of centralized Eastern imperial government in central Italy evaporated. Rome's social hierarchy in the 8th century. Moreover, Rome's social structure in 751 AD was stubbornly hierarchical, with echoes of its ancient past, but with distinctive medieval overtones. At the top of the pyramid were the patricians. They were elites, with many tracing their families back to ancient senators or high-ranking military officers. They owned most of the land, controlled key political offices, and shaped city affairs. They lived in grand domus, townhouses, on the city's hills. Also, the patricians had a distinct way of dressing. They wore a toga, which was a long, flowing garment made of wool. The toga was a symbol of their social status. The plebeians were the city's commoners. They were basically the working class of Rome, like farmers, tradesmen, artisans, and low-ranking clerks. Their lives were far less stable and their voices weak in local governance. Freedmen, former slaves, worked primarily in the trades as minor officials or in service jobs. Although they were no longer slaves, still they were never quite able to shed the stain of servitude, but were often more prosperous than the lowest plebeians, and the slaves were at the very bottom. Slavery persisted, but the labor market was shifting as the Roman world transitioned from the old imperial system toward a more medieval, land-based society. Many slaves worked in households on estates outside the city or performed the menial tasks that kept daily life possible. This hierarchy was inflexible. Movement between classes was rare, and, for those at the bottom, life was characterized by toil, poor living conditions, and vulnerability to exploitation. Family and gender. Next, Roman families remained strongly patriarchal. The paterfamilias, the oldest living man, was head of the household, holding legal and practical power over all, including adult sons, daughters, wives, and slaves. On the other hand, women managed homes, raised children, and, in wealthy households, supervised slaves and domestic affairs. While upper-class women enjoyed some influence, most were excluded from public office. Marriage, social mobility, and even day-to-day survival were tightly bound to one's family status and inherited connections. For many families, daily life was a battle to stay afloat, with mothers and daughters often working to supplement household incomes. Surviving the housing and neighborhoods housing was a stark reflection of social status. Domus, the grand, stone-built, multi-roomed residences of the very rich, complete with central courtyards, gardens, and sometimes private bathing facilities. Located on hills or elevated ground, these homes stood firm against the worst floods and fires. They featured mosaics, statues, and every available status symbol. Insulae were crowded, often shoddily constructed apartment buildings, sometimes up to 4 or 5 floors, housing plebeians, freedmen, and slaves. Poorly ventilated with paper-thin walls and shared, if any, sanitation, these buildings were dark, noisy, and vulnerable to both fire and collapse. The rich lived on the lower, more accessible floors, while the destitute crammed into the dangerous, less accessible upper stories. And in the nearby countryside, especially in the wake of post-imperial population shifts, many lived in rural-style timber dwellings, more typical of northern Europe. Crude longhouses constructed from wood, mud, and thatch. In Rome, traces of such construction persisted, particularly among the poorest on the urban fringe. Moreover, there was little privacy. Sometimes, entire families often shared a single room or bed. Windows, if present, were shuttered, and glass was an unaffordable luxury. Theft was common enough to inspire written complaints, while locks and security were rudimentary. The struggle for comfort. For the poor, comfort was almost non-existent. Bedding was stuffed with straw, replaced each year. Even the smallest fire risked deadly consequences. Lice, mice, and insects made their homes in every crevice. Only the wealthiest had access to down mattresses or fine linen. Heating came from fire pits or open braziers, making interiors smoky year-round. Candles or oil lamps were available, but most relied on sunlight or fire for light. Food supply and the marketplace. Also, feeding Rome's population had long been one of its greatest logistical feats. By 751, the once glorious grain fleets from Egypt or North Africa were distant memories. Rome's population was much smaller than in the imperial heyday, perhaps 30,000 to 50,000, yet hunger remained a constant threat. Bread and grain were dietary mainstays, but reliable supplies were threatened by war, weather, political instability, and the decline of imperial infrastructure. The system of state-sponsored, free monthly grain doles, annona, continued in some form for as long as possible, but with less regularity, especially as control passed from emperors to local authorities and the church. Other foods like olives, vegetables, pulses, the occasional cheese or fish were common, but meat and luxury items were rare for the poor. Seasonality and spoilage were major barriers, with little in the way of refrigeration. Marketplaces, foray and porticoed market streets, were lined with small stalls and shops. Working-class Romans used to buy bread, beans, dried apples, or cooked dishes from food sellers or popinae. But prices fluctuated and resources were scarce. Famine and malnutrition were never far away. Water and sanitation. On the other hand, Rome's water infrastructure still astounded visitors. 11 major aqueducts fed the city at its height, supplying public fountains, baths, and, for the lucky few, private homes. Yet, by 751, many aqueducts needed constant repairs as political upheaval, floods, and neglect led to frequent breakdowns. Water quality varied. In wealthier districts, it was reasonably clean. In others, contamination and the ever-present risk of disease was a fact of life. The Tiber, close by, was frequently polluted and not safe for drinking. Moreover, sanitation was both advanced and lacking. The Cloaca Maxima and other sewers ran beneath city streets, but most waste was disposed of in the streets or unmortared drains, especially in poor areas. Insulae generally lacked direct sewer connections, and waste from upper floors was sometimes tossed from windows onto the streets below. That's why neighborhoods were often plagued with refuse piles and the stench of human waste. Also, latrine blocks existed on the ground floors, but privacy and hygiene were always questionable. Disease, malnutrition, and public health. Rome's dense population, poor sanitation, and inadequate water made public health a nightmare. Endemic diseases like dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, and malaria were common. Flea and lice-borne fevers, respiratory ailments from cook fires, and outbreaks of foodborne illnesses regularly swept through the population. Periodic plagues in previous centuries, such as the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian, had wiped out portions of Rome's population. Although these plagues were before 751, chronic malnutrition and squalid conditions left urban dwellers susceptible to nearly any virus or bacteria that arrived via trade, travel, or seasonal migration. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making respiratory and infectious diseases deadly. Medical care was rudimentary, a privilege of the wealthy. The poor depended on superstition, home remedies, or whatever they could afford from itinerant quacks. Security and law enforcement. Also, there was no modern police force in 751 AD Rome. Instead, order was maintained by a patchwork of officials, religious leaders, and, occasionally, military units. The vigiles, originally fire watchers, acted as the city's night patrol and occasional enforcers against petty crime, arson, or runaway slaves. They were the closest thing Rome had to cops, but their authority and effectiveness were limited, especially with most drawn from the lower classes. The cohortes urbanae, urban cohorts, tackled more severe threats like riot police, crowd control, breaking up brawls or violent thefts. They numbered in hundreds, far too few for the size of the city. Now, in the 8th century, as imperial and city resources shrank, the efficiency and pervasiveness of such patrols faded. Much responsibility for security fell to neighborhood self-help, or in times of crisis, to religious authorities fielding ad hoc militias. Serious crimes like murder, rape, banditry, or fraud were met with blunt justice, beatings, fines, or execution. But investigation was basic and enforcement spotty. Most citizens looked to their extended families, patronal networks, or even local clergy for protection and redress of grievances. Religion and the rise of the Church. Moreover, by the 8th century, the Christian Church was not only the focal point of spiritual life, it substituted for the failing imperial government in many practical ways. In 756, Pepin the Short granted the Pope power over regions near Rome, giving rise to the Papal States. The Bishop of Rome, now the Pope, was the city's chief administrator, arbiter of disputes, protector, and benefactor. Bishops and their clerical hierarchies distributed food to the starving, organized public works, and sometimes intervened with Lombard or Frankish rulers to secure relief for their flocks. Churches and monasteries also functioned as places of refuge in times of disaster, and were often the only places where education, record-keeping, and social welfare could still be found. Religious festivals replaced many of the old imperial holidays, while processions and liturgies provided a sense of continuity and meaning. Rituals, festivals, and morality daily life revolved around the liturgical calendar. Dozens of feast days, commemorations, processions, and masses tied the community together. Some elements of old Roman paganism lingered in folk customs or place names, but by this time, Christianity was overwhelming, and public adherence to Christianity was expected. Churches were more than shrines. They were neighborhood centers, relief agencies, and sometimes the only source of hope for the poor. However, religious authority was not always benevolent. The church enforced morality, influenced local governance, and brokered social relations. Heresy, blasphemy, and accusations of impiety were serious charges, and the clergy could wield excommunication as a terrifying penalty. Also, the Pope's influence extended into all arenas of Roman life: personal, political, economic, and spiritual, currency, and the 8th century economy. Moreover, coinage, by 751, had changed dramatically from Roman times. The basic unit of currency remained the denarius, or in the Frankish world, the denier. But silver content had declined, and there were frequent shortages of small change. Gold was rare, and more exchange was done via barter or through credit extended by local merchants or landed elites. As commerce was less centralized, economic life revolved around the marketplace, the church's treasury, and the nascent monastic institutions, each a node of both economic and social power. Prices for bread, wine, oil, and firewood fluctuated. For the poor, even a minor shift could spell disaster. Farmers and smallholders from surrounding countryside brought goods to market and were taxed by local authorities, merchants, or whoever was strong enough to levy a tariff. Environmental challenges and floods. Also, the Roman fondness for building alongside the Tiber was always an environmental gamble. Floods were both frequent and devastating. Low-lying neighborhoods like the homes of the poor bore the brunt of these floods, which damaged insulae, submerged streets, and destroyed food stores. Government and charity worked to clean up after major disasters, but disease and displacement often followed. Rome's urban setting was no longer as green or well-maintained as in the old days, with deforestation, poor drainage, and uncontrolled dumping raising new environmental threats. So each flood, every fire, each epidemic slowly pushed the poor out, while the richer families retreated to high ground and safer, more secure homes. Transportation and movement. Next, movement in and out of the city relied on the famous Roman roads radiating from the city. Although many roads had deteriorated, their basic routes remained useful. Travel was slow on foot or cart, often treacherous due to potholes, rubble, and occasional ambushes by brigands. Communication with the rest of Italy and the outside world was a challenge, limited by road conditions, weather, and the political dangers of traveling through a patchwork of rival states and territories. Leisure was a privilege, and gone were the days of grand chariot races at the Circus Maximus or bloody spectacles in the Colosseum. By the 8th century, the entertainment landscape had shifted dramatically. Large-scale public amusements were rare. Instead, religious festivals and processions dominated the calendar, replacing games and spectacles with prayer and communal gatherings. Theaters were mostly in disuse or repurposed for other functions. Bathhouses, though still used by richer Romans, served social as much as hygienic roles. The poor, on the other hand, gathered in marketplaces, squares, and taverns to exchange gossip or news. A day in 751 AD Rome. Could you survive it? In short, living in Rome in 751 AD would mean coping with constant political instability with no single authority, shifting alliances, and real risk of war or occupation. Almost insurmountable class barriers with deeply unequal access to comfort, safety, or public power. Precarious daily survival, such as food insecurity, poor housing, unreliable water, and constant threats of disease. Environmental hazards like floods, fires, unsanitary living spaces, pestilence, and the constant risk of natural disaster. Limited personal security like sporadic law enforcement, ad hoc justice, and the omnipresent potential for violence or theft. Overbearing religiosity, a strong, ruling church shaping every aspect of public and private life, but also serving as the last bulwark against total collapse. So it's not just that modern people are softer than their medieval counterparts. Even someone with robust health, open-mindedness, and a willingness to endure hardship would face immense difficulties surviving just a single day in a society with so many sharp edges and narrow margins for error. Rome in 751 AD was a city in flux, its politics shattered, its class system rigid, its once great infrastructure battered but still functional in places, and its people battered by nature, disease, and the chaos of a changing world. For the average resident, simply surviving from sunup to sundown was an achievement and a tribute to their endurance. Clearly, if you stepped into their sandals for a single day, you would not last 24 hours without facing hardships most of us today could not imagine. Amidst all this, the Romans, guided by faith, tradition, and stubborn resolve, managed to keep their city alive and eventually reshape it for the medieval era ahead. So if you think you can handle an ancient city, think again. Rome in 751 AD is a formidable test of mind, body, and spirit. One day would be enough. It would be more than enough. Now, what are your thoughts about this video? Share with us in the comments section below. We would love to read them. Also, if you like this video, share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more interesting content.